So good day and welcome back to our study of the book of Mark. Today lesson 23, and we're in the chapter 7, verses 14 to 23. Now if you recall, Jesus had been speaking to a large group of people. They had come to the land of Gennesaret, and they had come in a large group of people. People recognized him and came out for a whole bunch. He laid hands on the sick in the marketplace. They begged him that he might just touch the hem of his garment, and as many as touched him were made well. But then the Pharisees and the scribes, coming all the way from Jerusalem, confronted him because he and his disciples had apparently broken the tradition of the elders and of the Jewish people. They did not accuse him of breaking the commandments that had been given to Moses, but they did accuse him of breaking the traditions, the traditions of washing before eating, the traditions of washing their utensils. And this was important to the Jewish people, even more important apparently than the commandments themselves. And then he referred back to them, to the scribes and Pharisees, when he talked to them about honoring your father and your mother, which is one of the commandments. And he says that many of the people there chose to use a term called korban. Choose to use a term called korban, which meant that everything they had was put into the trust of God, and therefore was not to be given to the parents, even though they themselves could use these assets for their own good while they were still alive. So this was an idea of getting around the commandments that the Jewish people at that time were using. So Jesus confronted the scribes and the Pharisees with these ideals and with these practices. And now as he gets on into verse 14, he says he gathered everyone together with him again. He had called all the multitude to himself, because this is now was the whole area, the whole people that were in his group that were with him at the time. He says, "Hear me, everyone, and understand. There is nothing that enters a man from outside which can defile him. Nothing which a person takes into his mouth from outside. Nothing which enters a man from outside which can defile him, but the things which come out of him. These are the things that defile a man. If anyone has an ears to hear, let him hear." What Jesus was saying was that what we take into our bodies is not a problem, and not a spiritual problem for us. The Jewish people had all sorts of rules and regulations regarding how to treat different pieces of food, different articles of utensils, before they could be used, because they felt that if the food and the utensils were not treated in this way, that this would be defilement against their spiritual inheritance. But Jesus said, it's not what you take into your mouth. And although he's referring here to food and to foodstuffs, it really implies to everything. It's not what we take into ourselves that may defile us or cause us spiritual problems, but what we put out that causes spiritual problems. So he says, anybody who has an ear to hear, let him hear. Now this is not new. This is really not new. It goes way back in Genesis 6:8. It says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth," because of what he was doing. Not of what the earth itself was doing, but of what mankind was doing. In Jeremiah 17:9 it says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked." So what he was saying is not what we take in, not the rituals, nothing to do with that. It's what we put out of our mouths, out of our beings, our attitudes, And he says this even further. When he entered a house away from the crowd, the disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, "Are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him? Because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods." This was entirely contrary to what the Jewish people had been taught for centuries. They were taught, for instance, that pork was unclean and could not be eaten. But it goes along with what happened to Peter in Acts chapter 10, when he saw the Holy Spirit bringing down something from heaven, and all sorts of animals and all sorts of foodstuffs were there. He initially declined to eat any of this because he felt they were unclean, but what God said, what God has cleansed, do not call unclean. Now this was a dramatic departure from what these people, including the disciples, were used to hearing, from what they had been taught, from how they had been brought up. And this is probably why they questioned it, because this was so much of a departure from their previous understanding and knowledge. Do you not understand, do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods? And although this really refers to foodstuffs, it really applies to almost anything. But the foodstuffs, the types of rituals that were done by the Jewish people in relation to foodstuffs and food were so vast and so extensive that it literally made no common sense. But this is what they were that they had been brought up to believe. Barclays says in his study, although it may not seem so now, because we're so used to the change, but at that time it was so ingrained, it may not seem so now. This passage, when it was first spoken, was well nigh the most revolutionary passage in the New Testament. And it says back in Matthew, if you go back to the same situation in Matthew, it says a little bit more about it there. It says, when he had called the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear and understand, not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man. Then his disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? Yes, they were offended because it went against everything that they had taught, everything that they had been teaching for centuries. So this was a very revolutionary statement. And it said, because it does not enter his heart but his stomach, and is eliminated, purifying all foods. So no food was really unclean. So this is what made this statement so revolutionary, and what it made so offended the Pharisees and scribes, and so offended the leaders, and was part of the reason why they plotted then to get rid of Jesus. He said, what comes out of a man defiles him. For from within, out of the soul, out of the heart, they say it here, out of the soul, out of the mind of a man, proceed evil thoughts, proceed adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and defile a man. So Jesus was saying all the rituals, all the trappings that the Pharisees and the scribes were using were of no benefit spiritually. In fact, it actually was part of the condemnation, because they were actually doing more and going against what Jesus wanted them to do, which was to love God and to love their neighbors. So this was a part of the reason why Jesus called the Pharisees and scribes sons of the devil and vipers. And it also means today that we don't need rituals. We don't need rites. We don't need a whole bunch of flamboyance. We don't need programs. We need only to believe in the gospel and to accept the gospel as to what Jesus told us in the death, in the burial, and the resurrection of Christ. That's the gospel of the New Testament. So what we take in, what people eat, does not cause them spiritual defilement. What comes out of a person comes out of their mouth, out of their attitude, out of their ideas that cause defilement. And it says here very clearly, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile a man. The story about Peter in the New Testament is mentioned in the book of Acts, chapter 10, and Proverbs, chapter 4, also goes over the same ideas. It is not what we take in that cause us defilement. It is not what we take in that cause a problem between us and God. It's what we think, our attitude, and what comes out of us that cause our problems. So we're going to get in further into this chapter next week as we start with verse 24. But that's sufficient for today. Concentrate on that and think about it. And next week we'll get on to the next part of chapter 7. So bye for now. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next week.